Let me introduce you to our latest sponsor, the Andre Law Firm. Andre Law can represent you or your business in a variety of civil and commercial matters. Do you have a client that has proven difficult to collect from? Andre Law also specializes in collection law and can expedite your collection on judgments from your defaulting clients. The principal of Andre Law Firm is Tony Andre, a North Miami native with years of experience representing businesses and individuals throughout the state of Florida. Based in Aventura, you can give him a call at 786-708-0813 or visit his website at andrelaw.com. Again, give Andre Law a call at 786-708-0813 to set up your consultation.
All right, I want to talk to you about a new sponsor of ours, and it's one that is very relevant to the moment. They're a new division of Greenview Construction, and they are called Making America Clean Again. Making America Clean Again holds certificates in bacterial, viral, fungi, and mold cleaning treatments. They offer professional cleaning, sanitizing, disinfecting, and sterilization services to a wide range of residential and commercial projects. You can do overnight ozone UV generator treatments or even permanently install UV ionized advanced oxidation technology into your HVAC system. Now, we know and understand, and quite frankly, we hope, that businesses across the state and nation remain shuttered as long as absolutely necessary to beat back the spread of the coronavirus. But when that time finally comes, having that certificate to display at your workplace showing that it has been properly cleaned by a licensed professional and maintained will go a long way to restoring that customer trust. So for more information, you can look up Making America Clean Again. You can go to their website at www.macainc.net, or you can just call them at 855-561-6653. Again, that's 855-561-6653.
Welcome to 3 Yards Per Carry, a podcast covering the Miami Dolphins and the NFL. Now, here's your hosts, Chris, Alf, and Simon.
And we're on, and welcome to a special edition of 3 Yards Per Carry. Normally, we'd be talking about undrafted free agents and the Dolphins plan to have fans at games this year, but we were met with the sad news this morning that pro football icon Don Shula has passed away at the age of 90, so we're doing a special edition of this show. I have Chris Kouffman here with me. I have 5 Reasons Sports chief and co-host of the 5 on the Floor podcast, Ethan Skolnick, and we will also be joined by Larry Blustein of Blustein Recruiting. So, Ethan, how will you remember the man?
Well, there's a couple of ways. I mean, obviously when you have some personal interactions with somebody, although I certainly didn't have as many as one of your other guests here, Larry Blustein, had, but when you have some personal interactions, you're always going to remember those. But then there's also sort of how you remember someone in the context of what they meant to other people. For me personally, I didn't cover him because my first year covering sports down here was 1996. So it was Jimmy's first year. It was after Don had been pushed out, and it was actually, Riley's second year. So it was this kind of new beginning, the way it was perceived for South Florida sports. You had this icon who was coming to coach the Miami Heat and run the Miami Heat, but you also had an icon being pushed out with the Dolphins, replaced by another icon in Jimmy Johnson. And so at that point, the Shula name, although obviously I had followed it, and I grew up in New York, so I was a Jet fan. So, obviously I followed it on the other side and was tired of losing to them. So, I knew everything about him, but I didn't know him, and so that was sort of an education. And at that point, the Shula name, I think, had been sullied a little bit because of the way that things went in 1995 with the 21 or 22 first-round draft picks and the season getting off to such a good start and blowing out Buffalo, and then ultimately, it falling apart at the end. And so, I think what people forget now is that, we're looking 25 years ago, but there was a big push to get Don Shula out. I mean, Jimmy Johnson was the hot guy. The way I look at it is it's kind of Jimmy Johnson at that stage was kind of like if Nick Saban had gone after winning, championships in Alabama and then won 2 in the NFL. Like, that's how hot Jimmy Johnson was. And so, there wasn't a lot of consternation about switching from Shula to Jimmy at the time. Now, looking back at it, you can say that, Jimmy may not have been fully invested, at least after the first couple of years. And then obviously the transition to Dave, and pretty much for the Dolphins, it's been downhill since. Obviously you hope for a revival now. So I think looking back at it, there should be more appreciation for what Shula did. I mean, to have 2 losing seasons in 26 when he was here, and I crunched the numbers today. I mean, they've had 15 losing seasons and the other 28. So that tells you, his impact. Again, the other kind of, the way I would look at him, from a tactical standpoint, and again, Larry can speak more to this, but what amazed me about him was looking at the older teams, which were basically run-based teams, defensive teams, and then turning over the keys to this gunslinger who was, the 5th quarterback picked in the first round, and basically just saying, we're going to play totally differently. And not only are we going to play totally differently, but we're going to put a couple of tiny little receivers around you that were not drafted high, and we're going to have this incredible offense. And I know that there was frustration that the defense and the running game never came with it, but those teams were pretty damn entertaining. And I think when you look back at it now, you'll say, okay, 10 and 11 win seasons, even if you lost in an AFC championship game to Buffalo, were not the worst thing in the world. So, I mean, I saw him a lot in his later years. I saw him when, he obviously was in the wheelchair, not as good health, but I have a lot of memories of, first thing, you always remember my name, which I appreciated because I didn't cover him. I mean, I did a couple of special section things with him, but I didn't cover him. And then also, he would go to a lot of Heat events. He would go to the Eric Reed, Tony Fiorentino events. And so, he had a presence there. And the one story I told today on a video I did was, I think it was about 6-7 years ago. I forgot the occasion, but at the stadium, Riley and Shula were both supposed to speak. I think it was for the opening of something. And we found out about an hour beforehand that Don was ill and was not going to attend. And I just remember seeing Riley when he found out, and there was tremendous disappointment. And he actually honored him, at the beginning of his speech. And then, of course, because it's Pat, he basically spoke for 2. But, it was pretty remarkable to see somebody who's risen to the total top of his game, doing a lot of the things that Shula did, have this reverence for this other figure in this town. And so I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I think I remember him in a whole different way, because I remember the Don Shula who first got here. 40 years old, 1970, kind of intertwined with the entire family. His 2 sons, Dave and Mike. I actually covered when I was young. When I was just out of high school, I started covering Dave at Chaminade, and then later on in the early '80s, Mike at Columbus. And Don, the great thing about this is, because I started when I was 16 years old in this business, and I had an opportunity to go to all the press conferences, especially during the summertime and during the camps. The one thing is you always used to hear the horror stories from the reporters, because no one wanted to ask him a question. I mean, because if it wasn't a perfect question, you might as well, hide your head wherever you could, because, I mean, he was a no nonsense guy. Great sense of humor when he wanted to, but the one thing, the things that I remember the most, and he knew me extremely well, because not only did I have an opportunity to cover his 2 sons, but his 3 grandkids. And I'll start with the first story, 1975 draft. And the drafts were great back then, because, not like now. I mean, obviously social media kind of rides the airwaves. And I mean, like when we were doing our show, the social media pretty much had every pick before we even, kind of could guess it. But back then, you would huddle in at St. Thomas, or Biscayne College, as it were, and here you had all the reporters, and in one room, and their war room was just his office, and it was just like an old school hardcore office. And the 1975 draft, and I always remembered, I said, there's a guy who he knew that I covered recruiting, and ever since I was young, and he walked by, I think this was about an hour before the draft. And he looks at me and he goes, "Who would you take in the first round?" And I'm thinking, well, here's Don Shula asking me, in front of everybody. I mean, you were talking the Tony Segretos and everybody of the world, and he's asking me. And I said, well, one of my picks would have to be Coach Freddie Solomon. I watched Freddie at University of Tampa. He was a quarterback. He had beaten the University of Miami the year before. I said, and I think he's going to project to a wide receiver. And all of a sudden, when they came up with I think after they picked Darryl Carlton with their first pick, I was sitting in there and you could see, they would come out, because I don't think ESPN was around, or they didn't cover it as extensively back then. But they would Charlie Callahan, who was there before Harvey Green. Charlie was a crusty old guy from Notre Dame, and Charlie comes out and he goes, they just took Freddie Solomon in the second round. He's a receiver from Tampa. Everyone looks at him. And I was just, here's a guy that I figured at the time would be a great fit. Well, long story short, they would go a certain amount of rounds that day. I think they would go 4 or 5 rounds, and then they would break for their lunch. So I'm walking over and by myself to the lunchroom, which was, I guess, if you guys have ever been to St. Thomas, we're maybe about 700-800. It was past where the dorm rooms were. And I'm walking by myself, and then all of a sudden I feel this like presence on my neck, and I look around and it's Don Shula, and he goes, "You think we listen to you?" And I'm thinking to myself, wow, because he still, to me, to this day, I don't have a lot of, guys and people in sports that I've ever really been, that and quote unquote infatuated with. Being a Met fan from the beginning, Tom Seaver was always a guy. Marcus Allen was always a guy that I followed. But here was a guy who, you got to remember, I grew up with this. My dad took us to St. Petersburg for the first ever Dolphin practice in 1966. We were there. So, to see that type of, here he was. This is an NFL team that, that we had looked forward to having. And here's a guy who we saw him in the Super Bowl with the Colts. And he was bigger than life. He really was. He was really bigger than life. And, for him to, like you said, Ethan, he remembered your name, albeit, he's in the later stages of his, of his life, as it were. And, he's still sharp enough. But imagine then, here's a guy, 45 years old, 44 years old, at the top of his game, had just come off of two Super Bowls, two Super Bowls, winning the first ever. And it kind of like really put things into perspective what type of person he was. He could be mean, gruff to a lot of people, but he could be kind enough to single you out, by yourself, with nobody really around. And, that was the type of relationship, because I covered the Dolphins for 11 years after that. I covered them when I was on WQAM or WIOD as a sideline reporter. And wouldn't you know that the years that I covered the Dolphins, the 3 years, they would kill people. So you hear, and I got the envy of covering the opposing team's locker room. So here I was talking to Chuck Noll after they just got their heads bashed in by the Dolphins who
got a start under Shula, by the way. Chuck Noll did get a start under Shula.
Yes, yeah. But to me, here's a guy who was bigger than life. And then I would later see him, guys, at all the events, and probably the most surreal. I've announced the high school wrestling tournament in Florida for 37 years. And here was Don Shula and Dave Shula back in 2006 in the hallway of the Lakeland Center with pen and paper, copying statistics of because their grandson is Dave's son, Chris, who wrestled at St. Thomas. But here, I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, how does this fit? Here's Don Shula, the most iconic football coach in history, in the bowels of Lakeland Center, copying down wrestling stats. And, and to me, I mean, I just said to myself, right there, that defines him as a person, because we've seen him as a head football coach. We saw him as a father, but here he is as a grandfather. And yeah, we saw him at all the games. He would go with Dave. David and his wife would work the St. Thomas games, and he would sit in the stands, and, people would notice him. But to me, that's football, and that's his grandson. But here's wrestling, an obscure sport. But you got to remember, he came out of the Midwest, John Carroll, Cleveland area, huge wrestling hotbed. So he knew the sport. And I walked up to them, to Dave and to Don in the hallway, and, hey, Larry, I know both of them and everything. I said, this just blows my mind. I even said that. I said, you guys, oh, yeah, we got to keep up with Chris. Who's going to wrestle next? And that's the Don Shula that I remember. I remember him kind of because it was always fun to see him in the early days covering when I covered a football, because I loved the post-game news conferences, the press conferences. I loved them because everybody was so, how now, you go to a Heat game and everybody wants to ask Spo a question, and, everybody's outgoing. But back then it was like no one wanted to really raise their hand in fear of maybe asking a question that's going to get him off. Because you want to be fair and you want to be balanced, but at the same time, look who you're being fair and balanced with. A guy who could snap your head off. All the way to the fact that here's somebody in the hallway of a obscure to most people, a wrestling tournament. And that's the guy I'm always going to remember. I'm going to always remember a guy who was the greatest football coach of all time. And you guys came in, in the tail end when he was being pushed out. I mean, not in the wildest dream, not even in the wildest would I've ever believed that back in 1975, 6, even back in the early, when he came in 70, all the way to when quote unquote, air quotes, when the game passed him by, I mean, that was the big thing. If you guys remember, the game passed him by. And I'm thinking, how could that ever be? How could the game ever pass by somebody like this who was so detailed? Who, Joe Rose and I talked yesterday about the same thing. It was weird before he even passed, talk about Shula and how detailed he was and how much of a hard ass he was. But at the same time, you look back and talk to Joe today and he goes, you know what? All the times that he berated me and, all the times he got on me for being overweight or this or that, he goes, you think back and I take it over and over again. And that's the effect he had. He was mean to be for a purpose. He made you run those gassers for a purpose. Back then in the 100 degrees and 99% humidity at Biscayne College, you're cursing him left and right. But you look back and you go, he made us a better football team. He probably, and I, you guys have been around football long enough, but he probably could do more with football talent than any head coach that I've ever seen. And that's a fact. They talk about Pat Riley doing the same thing. It's just a certain something that you have. And he had that.
Yeah, and we'll get to the football side in a second, but I'll remember him as the first sports celebrity in this town. In the early 90s, I remember the Don Shula show. He used to do it at the Shula Steak 2 in Miami Lakes,
right,
Main Street. And I tell people this all the time now, and they look at me as if I'm crazy, where you would have a football coach do a live-to-tape show at 7 o'clock that would air at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern. And at 6 o'clock, there would be a line around the block with people trying to get in to be in the live audience. He was that big. And he got whatever player he wanted, by the way, for his show. Like if Luis Alva had 3 interceptions in that game, that's the guy that was on the show. Dan Marino had a big game, he would be on the show. All of that went by the wayside, of course, down here as the team progressively got worse. But I'll never forget, I used to take a football, a helmet, an 8x10 week after week to get it signed because I used to collect a lot of memorabilia. And I remember after the fourth or fifth time that he had signed stuff for me, he looked at me one time and he goes, "Hell of a shrine you got going there." So he actually remembered me. But let me get Chris Kouffman in here on the football side of things. Chris, in 1982, the Dolphins make the Super Bowl and lose to the Redskins 27-17. They had a team that barely threw the ball. David Woodley wasn't that great of a quarterback, I should say. They had a good running game, they had a very good defense. He completely tears it apart. They draft Dan Marino, and gone are the 5 tight ends that they used to carry on the roster and the 3 tight ends they used to play often. And in come 4 wide receiver sets, 5 wide receiver sets, and they're throwing the ball all over the lot the following year. They go from being in the Super Bowl to going 12-4 the following year, and the year after that they go 14-2 and make the Super Bowl. In modern history, can you recall a coach that has just drastically changed styles just like that from one year to the next and continued with the success that Don Shula has had?
Not very many successfully. No. There have been efforts to do that before, and we've seen it in even in the Miami Dolphins. You know, when Tony Sparano sort of had his revelation that he can't go around playing this old school football anymore, and he brings in Brian Dable and tries to revamp things a little bit and open things up a little, and it just was not a success. But then you've seen Bill Belichick switch from what they were doing in, say, 2006 with the personnel that they had, which they didn't have very good skill position players, and they were more of a running and short passing and tight ends and stuff like that. And then they have an opportunity in 2007. They acquire Randy Moss as well as Wes Welker. And his name is eluding me right now, is Dante Stallworth, I believe. And
Yes.
And they go with this wide open 3 wide receiver, constant throwing the ball downfield. And they only paid a 4th round pick for Randy Moss. And of course, so they really revamped and redefined themselves on offense. And that's part of what has made Bill Belichick a great coach for the New England Patriots over the years. Not too many other guys have had their revelation that way and been able to execute it. And that's, I think, something that you have to appreciate about Don Shula in the way that he reinvented himself from, from Woodstock to Marino. So I think I had a comment on his legacy, I guess. Blue used the term bigger than life. And I thought that was interesting because for many Dolphins fans, a lot of Dolphins fans are like me, either weren't very alive at the point that Don Shula was coaching a lot of games for the Miami Dolphins, or too young to remember, or not paying attention to the Dolphins at that time. Then the Dolphins fan base is pretty young, I think, right now. And so not a lot of people actually have experienced Don Shula the way, Blustein has. And what's interesting to me is this concept of bigger than life, which is so accurate because there's this sort of ethereal quality about Don Shula. This shared, but not necessarily experienced nostalgia among Dolphins fans. The Dolphins fans that weren't really there for the Shula days still enjoy the Shula days. And it's because of this sort of shared ownership of a piece of NFL history. I was just reading, something earlier, Don Shula, who coached against George Halas and also coached against Bill Belichick. So he coached against a coach that was there for the very first season of the NFL in 1920. Mm-hmm. And he coached against a coach who is still coaching in the NFL today. So this piece of NFL history, this cornerstone of NFL history, belongs to us as Miami Dolphins fans, even if you didn't experience it. And I think that's an interesting concept, an interesting phenomenon. And it's something, especially for fans that have been around for mostly the last 20 years of banging their head against the wall. He provided this opportunity for nostalgia and for feeling good about the history of the program. And that doesn't go away with his passing. I think his legacy lives on that way. But it is valuable, and I think and poignant to point that out about the fan base today, because a lot of them weren't necessarily there in the 70s, 80s, or even the early 90s, and now they're mourning his passing just the same. And one story I will share is I have a friend who a couple years back, just only a couple of years ago, he got married, and he's a big time Dolphins fan. He's got a memorabilia room that probably outstrips any that you guys have seen, and I've seen it. He got married, and he decided to just shoot a shot and send out an invitation to Don to the wedding. And so it's like, go ahead, just do it. And Don actually filled out the invitation card and sent it back and autographed it and gave his best wishes. And it was like, right on the front, he's, decline with deepest regrets, and Miami Dolphins #1, see the back for autograph. And and that's that was just a testament to the kind of guy that Don was, and I'm grateful for him having been a part of this franchise's history.
Yeah. And Ethan, let's talk about the football here at the end of his career here. Mm-hmm. He went in the last 4 years 11-5 in the AFC Championship game. This is after everybody was saying that the game had passed him by. Then 9-7, then 10-6, and the second round of the playoffs. And then he finally finished with that year where they had the 22 first-round picks, and they went 9-7, and they lost in the first round to the Buffalo Bills. Now, everybody was freaking out toward the end of his tenure here, and I already just ran off it's 4 consecutive winning seasons, 3 of them in the playoffs. The excellence that he had here for 20, 30 years. I blame that ring culture that I don't know when it started. I think it started with Michael Jordan in the 90s, where if you didn't win like 6 championships, you were essentially worthless.
Right.
But the winning that he did down here. And it's interesting to me, and I guess you could speak to that. They blow him out of there, and Jimmy essentially reproduces a little lesser, because Jimmy never made an AFC Championship game. Reproduces the last 4 years of Shula's tenure here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we took it for granted, right? I mean, yes. I think that's, and that happened. Again, I'm equating this to the only figure in town who I think is comparable, which is Pat Riley, and it happened here in the past couple of years. I mean, there was a Riley washed crowd out there, right? Like, replace Pat. It's time for him to go. This isn't like a long time ago. This is like on draft night, like with Tyler Harrow, right? I mean, he's past his, and the reality was with Shula, some of that may have been true. If you look at his draft picks in the last few years, they weren't real good. I mean, there was Tim Bowens and there was O.J. McDuffie, but there was also Eric Kumaro and, Jackie. I mean, I don't know what we think of Jackie Shipp, but John Boza. I mean, there were a lot of mistakes. I mean, what was it? And was it Andrew Milner and Billy Green, or am I mixing that? No, it was Billy Milner and Andrew Green. It didn't matter. Neither of them were any good. I mean, he missed a lot, and he also really struggled to find players at certain positions. They always had pretty good pass catching backs, whether it was you bring in a Byers or a Terry Kirby, or you had a Tony Nathan, but they never really found a bell cow back for Dan. And part of that was the offense, but part of it was also they just never had anybody elite. I think if they'd had somebody elite, it might have looked different. He did a better job finding some receivers like an Irving Fryer and others towards the end, and I mentioned OJ, but there were some struggles on the personnel end, and let's not even get into some of the linebacker groups and particularly some of the DB groups. I think there was some reality to it that he had maybe slipped a little bit, or at least that part of it had slipped. But I think when you look back at it now and you see the 9 and 10 wins stacked upon each other over and over, or an 11 win, and then there were also some bad luck. I mean, Stojanovic misses a kick, right? That might have looked a lot different. We might look at Dan's career differently. Dan tears the Achilles in 93. How does that change things? And then I mentioned all the draft picks they brought in 95, or not the draft picks, but the former first-round picks, the Steve Entmans and the what was it, the Trace Armstrongs of the world. They brought in that year. Some worked, end. Most didn't. Eric Green. Yeah, and so there was some. He tried to patch things with some name veterans at times, whether it was a Keith Jackson or an Eric Green or again an Irving Fryer. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. So I think there was some truth to it, Alfredo. That on the personnel side, he wasn't perfect, but the team was still relevant. I mean, the team was still competitive. And I think when you look after that, and then you have Jimmy, who did a total teardown, effectively did it the first 2 years, I thought, building the base, accumulating draft picks, finding gems like Zach and Jason and Derek Rogers and others, but kept missing on the first-round picks. And then the big miss was Moss and Avery. And when he missed on Randy Moss or didn't make the bold move, which was very un-Jimmy-like, it all kind of went downhill. And, of course, he didn't really want Dan as his quarterback at that point anyway. And then it's turned over to Dave where, I mean, let's be honest, it kind of petrified, right? Like, I mean, I'm a Dave guy more than most are, but, I mean, he didn't build on it that much. He just kind of tried to sustain it until, Ricky and then the bottom fell out. And then since then, it's been a wasteland. So I think when we look back at it, we say, wow, we should appreciate that. And again, I covered the Dolphins for years, but as known as a Heat guy, I think Heat fans should be very careful. I think they should be very careful. I think, you cannot take for granted sustained success like Shula had, like Riley has had. Look at the Sacramento Kings. Look at the Arizona Cardinals for years. Look at the Cincinnati Bengals. You cannot take that for granted. And Shula did that and also created kind of a monument to himself in the way that he handled things and handled himself. And I want one thing with Blue. There are very few, pretty much doing this 25 years, there are very few personalities in sports that have gotten me a little bit, wow, okay, that guy's got presence, okay? Right. And when you step back a little bit, I mean, Pat was one for me until I was dealing with him every day. Muhammad Ali is one that I was in a room with. Michael Jordan, I remember I was in Washington when Michael was up there with the Wizards and was not even playing, I think, at the time. But I remember I was talking to Mitch Richmond in the locker room, and there was nobody else in the locker room, and I hear this booming voice behind me, "Can I have a minute with Mitch?" And I turned around, and, oh, there's MJ behind me, and it just, like, startles you for a second. There's a few people. Don Shula was one of those people, where when he was in the room, there was a certain presence that was different for him than anybody else. And look, every coach the Dolphins have brought in, the comparison was made. He's going to be our next Don Shula. And the reality is there is no next Don Shula. I think the current head coach of all the ones that I've covered or been around at all, and I'm not around Flores much, but a little bit, bears the most in similarity to him, honestly, of all the others. I think Saban might have been the other guy, but he wasn't really invested in it. But to me, there was the others did not. Adam Gase didn't have any resemblance to Don Shula. Joe Philbin, Cam Cameron, Dan Campbell. I mean, I don't want to relive all of it, but Flores is the first one that I think you can actually say, wow, there are some principles that Don believed in that I think Flores is trying to bring back to the organization.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, if you remember, the one thing that you could see with Flores now, never makes promises. Never said, well, we're going to be 9, and, never does that. He's learned, and that's the one thing about Don Shula. No matter what, he start the year out, and he would, we're going to win 12 games. Never said that. And, that's the one thing that you got to like about a head coach. I mean, he has his own expectations. He doesn't need to share them with everybody. He'll share them with his team. And I do remember after they lost to the Cowboys, and that he did say, and I guess it was, in the locker room after, and I think Bob Greasy kind of echoed that. He goes, I want you guys to remember what it feels like, because we're not going to feel like this next year. And that's the only thing. I mean, that of any type of motivation or any boastfulness, that's the only thing that I ever remember. And I see a lot of that in Flores. And I at the beginning of the season, when everybody's like kind of last year looking at Flores, oh, I don't know about this guy. But you could tell right away. He's all business. I mean, he's all business. He wanted to make sure we are not tanking, okay? Want to let you know right off the bat, I don't do that. That's not how I was brought up. And you got to respect that. You've got to respect that, and almost it almost reminds me of that movie Major League. I mean, they wanted them to lose so they would move to Miami or whatever it was, but and they never bought into it, and that's the way Don Shula was. That's the way Flores. That's a good comparison, Ethan, because I think out of all the guys that you mentioned, they're probably most businesslike, of any of the coaches. I mean, Tony had to be a little bit more circusy like and say, hey, you know what, we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and wait till we get the. But he didn't do that, and that's the one thing also that I always recall about Don Shula. Offer no excuses, never throw anybody under the bus. He would kick their butts in the practice, I'm sure, and tell them, but he would never openly, cut any of the guys down or throw anybody under the bus. And that's why people respect him. He might eat them up, in a room by themselves, but he would never do it where everybody could see it. And I think that's a lot what Flores does too. And I mean, you could credit Bill Belichick. I know that the Dolphin fans hate Belichick and what he does, but the guy wins, and he has a method to his madness, and I think that's what you're going to see over the next few years with Flores.
Yeah. And on the way out here, let me just get Chris in here one last time before we send you on your way. And we promise we will talk about undrafted free agents next week and Tom Garfinkel's plans to have fans in the stands. But Chris, one final thing. When you watch Brian Flores, do you get the sense that this is a different type of man, that this is a little bit more in the mold of a Don Shula, a serious person? And do you see the differences right away from Flores to the other guys that went after Don Shula?
Well, what I can say is that Flores is a little bit different than some, not a little bit different than others. Again, you have to keep in mind that as a fan that was probably about 14 years old when Don Shula retired, mm-hmm. I don't have that great of a working memory of him as a coach, as a coach of the Miami Dolphins. To me, Flores strikes a tone that's very similar to Tony Sparano, and that's what I would go first for a comparison in Miami Dolphins history. But I think you kind of alluded to it in Alf before, and it's worth reiterating the expectations and the victim of your own success, being the victim of your own success, and that's Don Shula in those latter days, because I may have only been 14 or 15 years old, but I was still old enough to register opinions among family and friends that pushing him out was the wrong thing, and that this is an icon of Dolphins history, and you shouldn't, even though I didn't have a clue what I was saying. But I think that you look at that and look at the draft picks that we've had recently, and then look back at the first round picks that he exited with Troy Vincent and mm-hmm. OJ McDuffie and Tim Bowens. Not just good players, not just sort of Jared Odricks and a guy like Devontae Parker that ends up one day having a good season. I mean, these are key people for the Miami Dolphins franchise. Part of the franchise history, and then okay, yeah, Billy Milliner. It's like, yeah, all right, maybe I don't think at the time that we had the same tools for evaluation and grading that we do today, and so the pendulum sort of, I really detest how the pendulum has swung the other way a little bit. We learn to accept the mediocrity of Ryan Tannehill and not try and do better. And maybe that's applied to some of the coaches as well. And I don't want to get on Brian Flores because I think he's been good at what he's done. But the fact of the matter is 5 games ain't a comparison to Don Shula. 5 wins ain't a comparison to Don Shula. And I know that he exceeded expectations, but his history has not been written yet. His successful history has not been written yet. And I'm anxious to see it. But we, back in the day, it's just such a juxtaposition between the mid 90s when Don Shula wasn't enough. Don Shula wasn't enough. And then today, when Ryan Tannehill is enough, or even 5-11, we're excited about this. I think the Brian Flores has a great opportunity to write his own history with the Miami Dolphins franchise, and that's what I'll say about that.
Yeah, and on the way out here, let me just say, one time at a Dolphins draft party, the Dolphins finished taking Tim Bowens, and I wanted Johnny Morton because I thought the Dolphins needed another wide receiver for Dan Marino at the time. And I remember speaking to Jim Mandich, rest in peace, and he told me, if the old man wants Tim Bowens, the old man knows something about Tim Bowens. And sure enough, Tim Bowens had a very, very good career here. He was an icon. He deserves to be remembered fondly. Rest in peace, Don Shula. That's it. There is no more. Thank you to Ethan Skolnick. Thank you to Larry Blustein. Of course, my co-host, Chris Kouffman. We will have Simon Clancy hopefully next week, where we will talk about other things, other happier things. But rest in peace, Don Shula.
Thanks for listening to 3 Yards Per Carry. You can subscribe via iTunes, on Podbean, or your usual podcast provider.